I mean, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me. That it's really a great honor, and it's nice to come to Ojai. I've been here before in the early. I think the first time was in 1990 when David Bohm did the dialogues. It was in the pavilion where Thought of the System. The book came out of that, and then a few times after that. But I wasn't here when Krishnamurti was here, so my meetings with him were at Brockwood, and but also in India. I went to India. That was, I think, 81, 82, like December, January, and that was quite amazing time. This was in Vasanta Vihar, and I was with Srinivasa Ramamudan, who was another. He used to be at Brockwood, who unfortunately passed away some years ago. Anyway, so that, but this. Somehow I feel that this Ojai is really the place, like it was Krishnamurti's home, and it's been very nice to be for a couple of days in the center and really sense the atmosphere over there. And so the way it worked for me was that I was actually studying in philosophy at Uppsala, but at the time I got interested in Krishnamurti. I actually heard it from a friend, a female friend, and I read a book trying to impress her. I didn't understand anything about the first book I read. I think it's called The Urgency of Change. But then over the next autumn and winter, I just happened to have some other books. I think there was this Matter of Culture was the book. And there were like few sentences, little things, bits and pieces there which made kind of sense. So I actually got interested in it much more than my friend was, and unfortunately that didn't lead it. It wasn't successful in terms of romance, but it did change my life. So maybe that was worth it. Okay, but and anyway, so there was the opportunity to go to Brockwood, which was great, and there, of course, one of the first things I heard was. There were sort of good physics teachers there. There was Brian Nicholson from Cambridge, and of course David Bohm was there, and they were talking about this non-locality business. That if you do something for a particle here, this will be affected instantaneously. I mean, there are many interpretations of that, but that's the way. And I was like, wow, the physics teacher told nothing about this in high school. We did quantum mechanics, but it was just another set of equations. There was nothing magic about it, and so I guess my interest in quantum mechanics goes back to 1980, and of course through Krishnamurti, people were talking about the brain, and David Bohm, but other some neuroscientists would come over as well, and so that kind of influenced my studies. So in my undergraduate, I studied both some cognitive neuroscience, and I'm very happy we have Uri here, who is a neuroscientist, and so. But also then philosophy and physics, and sort of. And after Brockwood, I left at '84. I went to Sussex University to do a master's in. And it's got a philosophy of mind, but I could do also philosophy of physics. And Sussex was one of the places where it was interdisciplinary, where you could actually do many subjects, and it was good for my interests. And afterwards, then I went back to Finland, partly because of the military service. I did the civil service instead, but you gotta do that if you can have a passport. And anyway, and so I signed up for Helsinki to do my PhD there. But then that was like late 80s, early 90s, and I was interacting with Bohm quite a lot at the time. And so we were really working on various projects. It was, of course, Bohm himself was very interested in his 1952 interpretation of quantum mechanics, which I will tell you a little bit about. And then there was the question of meaning and mind and matter and things like that, and those were very kind of powerful. And I'm still sort of, I've been kind of pretty much continuously working on those, but especially maybe during the past 2 years, focusing more and still trying to see if there's something there that could be useful. And so anyway, I think one thing to mention is that Bohm died in '92, and of course I was kind of a little bit lost because we even have a book project that was left unfinished. and I was still doing like my postdoc. So one thing I did was then to go and work with Basil Hiley, who was a, Bohm worked 30 years with Basil. I worked 30, Basil worked 30 years with Bohm, that's the way to say it. And I actually worked 30 years with Basil because he passed away this January at the age of 89, and he was still, full of energy, and we were all shocked, surprised. Anyway, so that way I kept the philosophy of physics quite strong all the time throughout the years. But another important thing, which kind of connects perhaps more to the Krishnamurti background, is consciousness studies. There was a big conference in 1994 in Tucson called, Toward the Science of Consciousness, and I went to the first one, and I really felt that was kind of an academic setting, bit of a kind of, people know, it's a bit like if you go to the poster session there and you miss the 60s, you get a little bit feeling of what it was like, right? It's quite a unique in many ways, but I think it's very open-minded. Usually, Stuart Hammer, who organizes, he would have his own agenda with microtubules and all that, but he would always invite people who do kind of new stuff. But then there was also the possibility for consciousness in a more experiential sense, which was kind of the Krishnamurti. So I kind of felt that was sort of an academic home also, so I pretty much kept going every 2 years, except when the kids were born. So Esther here is to blame that I missed maybe 1 or 2 conferences, but otherwise I was there. Okay. But anyway, so that's the sort of the context where my interest, philosophy of physics, and then also consciousness. Other than that, I teach, philosophy, all kinds of philosophy. And maybe connect, so my affiliations is Helsinki and Skövde. So in Helsinki, I've been a lecturer for a long time. It's a very good big philosophy department. Skövde is a very small university in Sweden, but we actually started there the first consciousness studies program in the world in 1997, and it's still going strong there. So that's again where I feel a little bit that it's Krishnamurti is maybe partly to blame, that in this tiny Swedish university where they make Volvo engines, all the Volvo engines used to be made there by Finns actually. So there's this consciousness studies there. Okay, but let's start. This was the fun part, and now it's going to be the maybe more of the little bit of work, and let's see where we get. Okay, I start with a person that's been very important to the field of consciousness studies, and also a personal friend. I actually met Dave 94 in the Tucson meeting, and you see what he did there. This was the first conference on consciousness organized by Stuart Hammer. It was like the first big conference on the topic at that time, And of course, you had all kinds of people there. There was neuroscientists, philosophers, and maybe a touch of parapsychology even, this kind of varied group. And so, but usually you see when the philosophers were talking, they might put a long argument there, like sometimes philosophers like to do. They have a slide, and then they have they have all the premises and the conclusions. Now that's fine for the other philosophers, but other people like neuroscience, they would fall asleep. They were snoring loud at the back benches, and and the guy had to go through the slides, and to show that the conclusion follows, And then comes David Chalmers, looked like a rock star. He had these plastic overheads, nicely some color text there, and what he said there is that we actually we have to divide and conquer the problem of consciousness. So they're the easy problems, what he called the easy. They're actually not easy, but there's how does the brain combine information? How do we produce verbal reports? Things that we can study by using scientific instruments. How does the brain function? But, he told, and everybody woke up, there is the hard problem. And well, what's that? What's hard? Well, the hard problem is, you see, in modern times, a lot of people, it's kind of a materialist age, so people kind of believe that consciousness is produced by neural processes. What Chalmers was saying that actually we have no idea how that happens. We don't understand how it happens. We don't have a theory that actually tells how like the color red, the qualitative experience of red arises from so-called these objective physiological processes. And I think I think people got the message there, and they in the year or two I followed, everybody was trying to solve the heart problem. So everybody said, no, I can solve the heart problem, and there were these books and volumes published. It's still there. It's now 30 years and we haven't solved the heart problem. There are a few people, a few candidate theories. And I'm going to say something about that as well. But that's just to show that a single talk in a single meeting can have sometimes a very big influence on the entire field, especially if it's an interdisciplinary audience. And now I should say that not everybody agrees there is a heart problem. So, they're the problem deniers. But anyway, I think still majority of researchers agree that there is one. Okay. So that's just this, and this actually the article was in Scientific American in 1995. So that's about 30. So we are now 30 years back. Just to set the stage a little bit. And I just say something, if you wonder what do we mean by consciousness, like Jaap was saying. So this is a quotation from Dave saying that when you look at the slide, you are conscious of it, directly experiencing the images and words as part of your private mental life. You have vivid impressions of colored flowers and vibrant sky. At the same time, you may be feeling some emotions and forming some thoughts. Together, such experiences make up consciousness, the subjective inner life of the mind. So this is just to give you an idea of what people mean when they use the word consciousness in consciousness studies, commonly. And this is sometimes summarized as phenomenal properties, that, these, like the qualia, the colors, they're called phenomenal properties, as opposed to, let's say, the physical properties that the brain also has. Okay. And you see, now I say a little bit, this is a bit like the sorts of questions philosophers worry about. And in the case of consciousness, people could ask a question like, can consciousness, in the sense of what it is like to be an organism, or in the sense of phenomenal properties, be reduced to physical properties? That's another, you see, I'll stop at this, what it is like, because you see, it's difficult to define consciousness, but back in 1974, this is way before Dave Chalmers, the philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote the article called What It Is Like to Be a Bat. And there he defines that to be, if a system is conscious, there is something it is like to be that system. So there's this qualitative field. And so I guess the simple idea here is that, in science people would assume there's nothing it is like to be a rock. Rock is, but there's nothing it is like to be a rock, whereas there is something it is like to be, let's say, a human being. But the question then is, well, if this is what consciousness is, can we reduce it to physical properties? And then you could say, well, why do people want to reduce? Well, this goes back to the problem of dualism in Western philosophy. When Descartes defines consciousness and matter with mutually exclusive properties, then he sort of, in a way, creates a big gap, and he spends the rest of his life trying to bridge it, and he didn't quite succeed. And so you see, for philosophers, dualism is something they want to get rid of. They find it problematic. That, if we have dualism and we don't understand how the two things are related, we got a problem. It's called the mind-body problem. So one option there is, well, let's reduce, in the sense, can two become one? So is there a way we can actually solve the problem of dualism? And you see, one way to do that is to say that consciousness, yeah, it looks cool, it has all these exotic properties, but maybe they're a bit, in fact, they're nothing but physiological brain processes, and that's it. That's all there is to say. And others might say, no, there's, what exists is some universal consciousness, and matter is some kind of construction from that. But there's only one thing, idealism, okay? That's fairly popular these days. Some people who advocate. And sometimes I find myself the bad guy saying, sometimes I've had some panels with Deepak Chopra or others in these meetings and who advocate idealism, and then I tend to still think, well, and they argue for it, but I personally think that that's not the only solution there is. Okay. But anyway, so with reductionism, of course, it sort of has its attraction, and there's a long tradition. I just mentioned a couple, U.G. Place and Smart. But then, of course, there's a long tradition in philosophy also to challenge the reducible bit of consciousness. Thomas Nagel, I mentioned, would be one of them. But in recent years, it's Dave Chalmers that I already mentioned. And you see, now, why does Chalmers think that we cannot reduce consciousness to matter? Well, he wrote this book, which is actually a very nice book, which I recommend if anybody really wants to learn about these things. It's kind of based on his PhD thesis, but then he worked it out for the Oxford University Press, and he's sort of. I don't agree with Dave about everything, but I love his writing, and I often go back to the book even today. So what does he say? Well, he says all reductive physical explanations refer to structure and functions. So he's saying that if you say that a certain phenomenon is let's say heat is reducible to molecular motion, then you're referring to the molecules and their functions, what they're doing, certain structures. But then, so Chalmers' main argument is that conscious experience involves something beyond structure and function, and therefore it cannot be reductively explained in physical terms. And you see, what happens there is that Chalmers then say, okay, if we cannot reduce consciousness, then they must be fundamental properties. So let's explore the possibility that there are fundamental properties. Because in physics, we also have fundamental properties, like electric charge, or others that you feel that, you just have to assume them. You can't sort of derive them. So this was, and of course, you might already smell a little bit dualism here, because, okay, now what, so, and wasn't dualism a bad thing? And so Chalmers has his own way to navigate this issue. He's kind of bold, introducing some kind of dualism at the age of where most, at least a lot of his philosopher colleagues are so-called physicalists who kind of don't want to say that consciousness is fundamental. I mean, they're happy to say, well, it may be a little bit non-physical, but still they would always feel that the matter is more fundamental, consciousness is somehow a little bit less fundamental, okay? But Dave, he advocated the idea of consciousness as fundamental. Now, so what happens? Okay, in physics, if there are fundamental properties, the way you connect them by fundamental laws. But if we want to, now we have also these fundamental phenomenal properties. So to connect them to physical properties, it's not enough to have fundamental physical laws. Dave said we need fundamental psychophysical laws. Okay? And here, we can see that as a candidate for such a law, Chalmers proposes a double aspect theory of information. where in this view information is assumed to be fundamental, and it has two aspects, the phenomenal and the physical. Okay? So you see, we are in some ways, here we are saying there is only one thing. So it's monism, it's not dualism in that sense. But this one thing has these two aspects. One of them we call the phenomenal aspect, and the other one the physical. So for example, your experience in this room has a phenomenal aspect in the sense, okay, let's say there's information in your brain, and this information has a phenomenal aspect, and that's all the colors and everything you experience. But that very same information is also physically implemented in your brain. So this one thing information which has these two aspects. This will be the key notion later on in the talk as well. So that's the note that. And so okay, so now and you see now this is supposed to be a law. This is supposed to be a psychophysical law, that information has these two aspects. Okay. Now, what does it mean? You see, because there's information in the thermostat. Does it mean that the thermostat is conscious and has phenomenal properties? Sounds pretty crazy, hey? So therefore, Chalmers acknowledges that, fair enough. Maybe we should restrict the laws in a way that only information processed in a certain way would have phenomenal properties. Let's say the way the brain processes information. But not the poor thermostat, There's nothing it's like to be a thermostat, but there's something it is like to be a brain. But you see, the more radical alternative is to bite the bullet and say all information has always both a phenomenal and a physical aspect. And the way to, alleviate that a little bit, make it a bit milder, is say where there is simple information, there are simple phenomenal properties, while with more complex information, the phenomenal properties are more complex. So human experience, you have, complexity, but the thermostat has just a tiny bit of something phenomenal, okay? That's the way the Chalmers sets it up. And you see, looking at it back, I've recently go back to look at these things and perhaps appreciate them more than I did 30 years ago. And I would say there's a certain beauty, elegance, and simplicity about Chalmers' theory. He's a good philosopher. Given that it seems difficult, if not impossible, to reduce consciousness to physical properties, why not accept that it's fundamental? And given that it seems obvious that conscious experience and physical processes are closely correlated, one simple way to explain the correlation is to assume that there exist psychophysical laws. Okay, let's give it to Dave, huh? But there's a problem. You see, one trouble is that it leaves phenomenal properties, what we call epiphenomenal. And that's a technical term in philosophy. It just means something that is exists but has no causal effect. So sometimes we say if you have like a steam engine producing, the smoke is an epiphenomenon. It doesn't influence the operation of the engine. It's just produced but does nothing, okay? And this is, you see, now why are phenomenal properties epiphenomenal here? Well, you see, Chalmers, he accepts the principle of the causal closure of the physical domain. What's that? Well, that says that there is no need nor any room to appeal to non-physical phenomenal properties to explain physical events, such as physical actions. So, like if I lift my hand, that's a physical phenomenon, and if I want to explain why that happened, this principle of the causal closure say I have to look for the cause in the physical domain. There's no need, and it's not allowed to go to any phenomenal properties. Physics is closed. Physical domain is causally closed. And you see, that's kind of ironical because you see, I think John Searle made a bit of fun about this, because you see, many people feel that David Chalmers' book, The Conscious Mind, is the most important contribution to philosophy of consciousness there's been to, okay? The book is a physical object, okay? But Chalmers' own theory seems to imply that his own consciousness, his own phenomenal properties, played no causal role in producing that book. So the book could have been written by what we in philosophy call a zombie. A philosophical zombie is somebody physically exactly like us, but without phenomenal properties, okay? So, so you see, so that's why, although Dave's theory has certain beauty and elegance and all that, this is not very good end result. For phenomenal to be epiphenomenal. I mean, that's a play of words, but you still. I think if consciousness really and if phenomenal properties really are significant, it would make sense that they can make a difference, also physical world. And I think John Sherwood here said, do you mean to say nobody ever ate because they were hungry? Meaning that hunger is a phenomenal property that you want to eat. But if hunger is epiphenomenal, no, hunger, your feeling of hunger had no role at all. It was nothing but machinery and physiology, okay? Okay, so let's see. So I think you see, this is one of the things philosophers worry, is epiphenomenalism. And Jerry Fodor actually, he diagnosed the disease here. He said, philosophers of mind suffer from epiphobia. Now, what is epiphobia? Well, it's the fear that one is becoming an epiphenomenalist. You're making a theory about mind, and at the end of the day, mind has no causal efficacy. You don't want that, okay? All right, so now with that introduction, which is really kind of very much a summary of the situation in philosophy with regard to what David Chalmers opened up. Now we come to what I've been trying to do with it, and actually, we even had Dave Chalmers in Skövde in Sweden. This was year 2000, so we had a millennial workshop there where I tried to give him my sermon, but I haven't been able to convince him, so he believes in his own stuff. But anyway, here we go. And you see, remember the hard problem of consciousness is, how can we explain, it seems obvious that, there are physical properties, the body and the brain. It seems obvious that there's also consciousness, the phenomenal properties. People believe that the brain produces those phenomenal properties, but nobody has an idea how they do that. And people are trying, but nobody believes. None of the theories currently has a majority believing or accepting them. So that's why it's called the heart problem. Now, people, there are people who are bitten by the quantum bug. Now, what's that? Well, it's like myself, at the tender age of maybe 20, somebody Brian Nicholson at Brockwood tells me about non-locality, and I'm like, wow, that's very cool. So I still, if you're bitten by the bug, there's no cure so far. And so people who feel the quantum theory is somehow deep, significant, they, of course, try to solve the hard problem by making use of some ideas from the quantum toolbox, okay? And there are actually many different approaches. I won't cover them, but maybe I could mention Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. They have a very exotic and interesting proposal. But then, of course, David Bohm had ideas here too, which are not as well known, but I feel in some ways perhaps more promising than the Penrose-Hameroff. I mean, Stuart Hameroff is a dear friend of mine, and anyway, so he's kind of open to these ideas, but still, I think he's very much committed to this his own view. Okay. However, but anyway, David Chalmers, I mean, he knew about these things. He's interested in quantum mechanics. In his book, The Conscious Mind, there's actually one chapter about quantum mechanics. So he's one of the few philosophers who really takes this possibility seriously. But you see, what he said that, okay, somebody will say that, you need this, gotta be something happening in the brain at the level of atoms, so-called involving non-trivial quantum processes that somehow help to create consciousness. What Dave says is that if you tried that, your quantum mechanical explanations appeal to structure and function, and are thus incapable of reductively explaining consciousness. So even it doesn't, maybe neuroscientists might hope to explain consciousness at the level of neurons, action potentials, synchrony, macroscopic neurophenomena level. People who do quantum mechanics here, they see, well, maybe there are some areas in the brain like the microtubules where quantum coherence could survive and do its magic. David Chalmers says we're still proposing structure and function there. You haven't solved the problem. But I'm using that as a bridge. You see, what I say is that there is one interpretation of quantum theory which is actually very close to David Chalmers' double aspect theory of information, and which might be worth exploring. So maybe I'm trying to use a little bit Dave Chalmers' own weapons against this claim that quantum mechanics won't help, okay? Now watch this interpretation. Well, this is the so-called pilot wave interpretation in the form that it was further developed by David Bohm in cooperation with Basil Hiley. And of course, actually the theory was discovered already by Louis de Broglie in 1927. But it was David Bohm who made it consistent in 1952. And so that's, you see, and one of the features of the pilot wave theory that actually shows that the deterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics is possible. Usually, if you know anything about quantum mechanics, you know that it's indeterminism. God plays dice. And then you may know that Einstein didn't agree because he said, no, I don't believe God plays dice with the universe. And the the physicist Jack Sarfati says here something like that the dice is loaded and the house always wins. Anyway, but you see, okay, but we're not talking so much about the determinism here. We're going to be talking about some other features. And this, some of you may recognize, the picture is from the film Infinite Potential, which is a recent film about Bohm by Paul Howard. Okay, now quantum mechanics here will be very, very simple, so don't worry. Although Richard Feynman, of course, said that nobody can, I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics, but of course he was wrong because here we can understand it. So what does this interpretation say? It says that it assumes that an electron is a particle always accompanied by a new type of field or pilot wave described by the wave function. And you see, that may sound fairly innocent. I mean, it sounds kind of, interesting. Because usually when we think of elementary particles, we may think that there are these little billiard balls and maybe they collide with each other, or maybe we put them in the particle accelerate a lot of energy and then we get more little thingies, like more particles. So this is the popular image of the particles of physics. For physicists, actually, the so-called standard interpretation of quantum theory doesn't assume that the electron is a particle all the time. They actually use a thing called the wave function to describe it. So either they say we can observe it, let's not talk about it, let's just talk about our microscopic measurements, or they say, well, we must think of it as some sort of a field. Okay? What the Broglie-Bohm theory does, it puts the particle, to say the electron is a particle, that's the radical statement here. The other radical statement is that this field is actually, it has this field with it. So it's a particle and field. And again, this is, if the theory is true, we are made of these things. In some way, we are constituted of. So if you like, this is a materialist. We start out with saying, if you're a materialist, this theory is correct, that's what you believe in. Okay. This is a slide from Basil Hiley. I couldn't make anything this nice. And this is just to show you how the thing works. This is the famous two-slit experiments where you can shoot electrons one by one. They come from the left. For the left picture, those are the trajectories they take. And this thing there, this mountain there, is where the electrons are coming from those two holes toward you. And so what this is describing, what the mountain is describing is the influence of the pilot wave. It's an energy, and it just means that the poor particle, if it comes from here, it doesn't want to go up all the way there. It doesn't have the energy. And you can see it in the other picture. You see they're coming that way. None of the trajectories go to the region over there. So these two pictures are related, okay? But I'm not going into details here. I just show that this is kind of just summarizing the theory. And it has this, the radical thing here is that it has this new quantum potential energy in it. So you see, because if in classical physics, in this situation, the particles coming from the holes this way, they would just take straight lines. But because of quantum mechanics, you have an extra term, the Q, which gives rise to a new energy landscape, and you get these trajectories. And what you're doing here, you're actually explaining the wave particle dualism, because that's an interference pattern. So this is why people would value the Bohm theory. But anyway, so I'm just going to talk about some aspects here, but this comes, you get this out of the Schrödinger equation, so you don't really have to add new entities to quantum mechanics. So this is actually Roger Penrose, sometimes discuss with him and ask him about these things. And he says that actually the Bohm theory, if you want to do quantum mechanics, the Bohm theory is the most beautiful way to do that. Penrose then will add, but I don't believe quantum mechanics is the final theory. So he has his own version. But so much he would acknowledge, and that it's some people feel it solves the measurement problem, things like that. It has its own difficulties, like every interpretation of quantum mechanics. I won't go into them, but just to mention that it's not universally accepted, but it has its sometimes fanatic supporters. Okay. Now you see what's happening here is that early on Bohm himself didn't like the theory that much, because for one thing he didn't like this term Q. He thought this Q, quantum potential, which is the energy, he thought the mathematical form is strange and arbitrary. So he felt this is something that we have to throw away later on as we keep working, make it better. But at some stage he realized that actually you could try to give a physical meaning to this pilot wave, and mathematically it means that it's only the form of the field of the wave that determines the energy and the influence on the particle. And so, whereas you see, you would usually think that it's the size of the field, like the size of the water wave that determines the energy and influence. But here it's only the form. And you see now what's the form of the form reflects the form of the environment. For example, whether you have 1 or 2 slits open there in the experiment I showed. And so you see, you could say that this pilot wave carries information about the environment. And you see, this is information not for us, but for the particle that is guiding. And again, here's this point that I mentioned, that it's different from the water waves. And whereas here we think of the pilot wave as informing the movement of the particle. And so, again, I won't go through too much detail with these things, but this is something that I actually discovered. They got this 93 book, and I recently was looking at it again and discovered some interesting things. Is that you see, in quantum mechanics, people they wonder about the nature of this quantum field, this so-called pilot wave, and Bohm and Hiley, they have a new idea of it as something, not an ordinary physical field, but it's really this idea that we should see it as some sort of information that is carried by some small energy. But the idea is that we have like this something there that's much more subtle than the particle. And so, so here I'm just trying to summarize some of these ideas. So what they would say is that a certain kind of information is a fundamental feature of reality. And it's not non-physical, because for there to be information, there has to exist a small energy. But even so even if it's physical in some sense, it is still, we should really see it as something quite different from usual matter. And now we move toward the mind, because you see, you could say that if Bohm is correct here, you could say that certain kind of activity of form plays a fundamental role at the quantum level. And you could ask, well, okay, so what are the implications? And he would say that this makes the quantum level mind-like. For he thinks that an essential quality of mind is just the activity of form rather than of substance. And he sees, now in philosophy, views like this, you are going toward a view called as panpsychism, that everything has consciousness. In the case of Bohm, he would say, no, the electron is not conscious, obviously, but he would say it has this mind-like feature. Now we could say, well, what does this activity of form mean? Well, Bohm liked to give this example, so there's a simple example. When we read a printed page, we do not assimilate the substance of the paper, but only the forms of the letters. And it is these forms which gives rise to an information content in the reader, which is manifested actively in his or her subsequent activities. So you see, you don't need to eat the newspaper in the morning. You just abstract the form and somehow magically it means something to you, okay? And so, you see, now the radical postulation here is that a similar mind-like quality of matter reveals itself strongly at the quantum level, in the sense that the form of the wave function manifests itself in the movements of the particles. So notice again, the pilot wave is not pushing and pulling the particle, it's informing the particle, like the newspaper is informing you, okay? There's an analogy between these two. And you see, importantly, this quality does not appear to a significant extent at the level at which classical physics is a valid approximation. So you see, the classical physics that's usually dealing with it, we don't see this kind of activity of form there. You only see it in these quantum experiments, okay, for example. So the claim is that more fundamentally, at the quantum level, matter is mind-like, but for the matter we typically meet in everyday experience, in the domain of classical physics, these mind-like qualities are negligibly small. And you see, the general point here is that it might well be easier to understand the relation of mind and matter if we take into account the quantum level. This is a general metaphysical claim. For this is what philosophers that really, rather than throw the baby out even before you put it into the bathwater, give quantum mechanics a chance here. I mean, there are ways of doing that. You see, now, one confusing thing here is the notion of information, because usually when you talk about information in scientific context, you're talking about something known as Shannon information. But this, what Bohm and Hiley call active information, it's thought to be an objective commodity. It exists out there in the physical world, independently of the human mind, and it makes things happen, okay? Whereas Shannon information is typically, it's kind of a quantitative measure that represents the way in which the state of a system is uncertain to us. So for example, if I'm waiting to hear the result of a football game, then I need one bet to know which one won. But before that, I don't know. And it's this uncertainty that's represented by this information in the Shannon case. It's has to do with us in a different way than this Bohm-Hiley information. You see, so they would say that, you see, so this active information is not essentially related to our own knowledge or lack of it. Information in the parallel wave it's information that is relevant to determining the movement of the electron itself. And they're saying, well, actually, this is the way we also use information, the notion of information all the time. It's the literal meaning, to inform, actively to put form into something. And you see, there are many other, the favorite example here is the way radar waves guide the movement of a ship on autopilot. The radar waves are not pushing and pulling the ship, they're just informing the energy. But of course, in computers, information content in a silicon chip informs the electrical energy. In biology, it's the form of the DNA molecule that guides protein construction. And now we might get very sad. Is there nothing for us poor human beings? Yes, there is. You see, maps, for example, everything else. The way, you see, when you're reading a map, it will inform the subjective experience of a person and helps to guide their activities. So although you see the notion of active information is not dependent on human consciousness, it doesn't mean that it's not also in human consciousness. And this then leads Bohm to propose this new theory of the relation of mind and matter. And so I'll go into this a bit, and then we can also move into a discussion. And you see, so to make the connection there Bohm made this suggestion that we could see the human mind as a hierarchy of levels of information. So for example, in perception, information in the more manifest levels would be carried toward more subtle levels in the brain mind, where the meaning and the information would be apprehended. So that's like our experience of reading the newspaper, okay? And Bohm called this the soma-significant relation, in which the physical or the soma is significant or has meaning to the more subtle mental levels. He preferred soma significant to talk about the psyche, but anyway. You see, and then there is a reverse. You see, when the meaning is apprehended, this often gives rise to a signosomatic process, where information in the higher, more subtle mental levels acts downwards and organizes the more manifest physical levels, leading to physical action. And again, you see the meaning of physical action would carry back, and you get this what we call in perception action cycle in cognitive science. But Bohm is trying to give it the new interpretation because he has a different kind of notion of information here. And you see, this is an important. You could say that generally the total physical response of the human being is profoundly affected by what physical forms mean to him. Bohm's favorite example was that you're walking in a dark night and then you see a suspiciously looking shadow. You've heard actually that there was an assailant in the neighborhood, and if you now interpret that shadow as the assailant, this will really profoundly influence your, you get a reaction of, adrenaline and all the stuff will get going. But you see, more generally, the idea was that a change of meaning can totally change your response. And Bohm had these slogans like, meaning is being. So he really felt that the meaning, what things mean, that's the essence of our being. Okay? A change of meaning is a change of being. And that's where I think this connects very much with Krishnamurti in the sense that that exploring meaning in certain way through these perceptions and so on might result in the change of being. I mean, Krishnamurti was not a neuroscientist, but he had the sense that even through meditation and things, maybe what he called this perception, the brain might operate in a different way. And of course, I think there is at least some scientific evidence for this kind of the idea that what things mean to us can have a profound influence. Of course, I mean, we know that through stress. All psychosomatic illnesses, of course, come into this picture, but perhaps also other possibilities of well-being. And of course, you see, now the this thing is, we have to be careful when we talk about meaning because that will, of course, depend on context. Okay. So to understand how meaning acts, we have to understand a lot of other stuff, right? Okay. Here's just a schematic picture of the way Bohm was thinking about it, which I like to call the two-way traffic between. You can see on the upper is like where the upper is the soma, significant relation where physical forms become significant from level to level. I mean, you could think of the retina as one level, the visual cortex as the next level, associated, depending on what our neuroscience says, you could try to apply the figure. And then somewhere here, a miracle happens, interpretation of whatever it means, and then it will kick back to the. So, for example, the example of the shadow in the dark night, once it's interpreted as danger, then it will kick back to the action and you either, what do? You freeze, or you flee, or you fight. But that depends, of course, on your muscles and the context, if you want to do that. How quickly you can run and all that. Okay. But you see, again, this is interesting because this is what it is, when my work as a philosopher, for philosophy of mind, it's extremely difficult to have this notion of two-way traffic. Because we assume that, the brain, in a way, is all there is. Maybe there are mental properties, but they're epiphenomenal. So what's really missing in philosophy of mind is agreement. How does this thing work? Does meaning or mental states genuinely influence the physical domain? And how could they do that if we get dualism, right? Okay. And so I could maybe just close it by coming to connecting this to the David Chalmers approach that I mentioned at the beginning, because I would suggest that, you see, we in this Bohmian scheme, we see these principles in operation which are candidates for psychophysical laws. You see, we could say, so we have this thing, if we say physical forms give rise to an information content, if we make that into a general principle, it's there in, Bohm is claiming it's there in quantum mechanics, so it is fundamental. And we could call that the soma significant law. And then the other side is the information content is manifested actively in what happens in the physical side. So this would be the signosomatic law. And you see, note that meaning matters here. So what I suggest that this might be a way to have a non-epiphenomenalist theory, okay? That's why I felt, this is why I kind of stuck with Bohm, because I always felt he had this, and I don't see that in philosophy of mind. I don't see that in neuroscience and probably, maybe Yuri can correct me there, but I just feel that we're lacking this step of, and how does Bohm do it? Well, he postulates it. He postulates this summa significant. Everybody has to make some assumptions in philosophy and science. And he's assumed, so the key point here is that physical forms gives rise to information content. So that's the give rise to is where the magic happens. And then if we want to criticize, then that's where we might want to have the discussion. Okay. And so just maybe a couple of, how am I doing with time? Few more minutes?
5 minutes.
Okay, very good. So you see, so let's just have a little bit more there. And you see, Bohm also assumed, and this was independently of and earlier than Dave Chalmers, that information has this dual aspect nature, being simultaneously physical and mental. But you see, unlike Chalmers, he didn't explicitly refer to phenomenal properties, but to the mental in general. And this, you see, this is also when I was interacting and working with Bohm quite a lot. This was like, from the mid-80s to early 90s. Consciousness was not yet the big thing in the philosophy of mind, cognitive science. We were talking about connectionism, AI, stuff like that, mental causation. But it wasn't like the consciousness was the big thing. So in a way, I regret, because I would have liked to see what he had to say. I mean, this is kind of thing that you never, we kind of went around it, but we never really took that as the key question. So in that sense, I feel that the credit goes to Chalmers in the sense that he really put phenomenal properties to the picture, which we did not. But anyway, so here's a quotation from Bohm. He would say that, at least in the context of the process of thought, there is a kind of active information that is simultaneously physical and mental in nature. Okay? So Bohm is taking this to be obvious, or a fact. Okay? Active information can serve as a kind of link or bridge between these two sides of reality as a whole, and these are inseparable. So this is trying to avoid dualism, okay? Because these two sides are inseparable in the sense that information contained in thought, which we feel to be on the mental side, is at the same time a related neurophysiological, chemical, and physical activity, which is then the material side of this thought. So, I mean, you could say that Bohm is talking about consciousness here because he's saying that we feel to be on the mental side. I mean, I guess you consciously feel. I mean, if you're not conscious, I guess you're not feeling it, right? So, I mean, it's kind of implicit, but but Bohm doesn't say where does the conscious feeling come from. So he's kind of taking that for granted. So I think in that sense, it would. This is not an explanation of consciousness, but it's still trying to say how information has this. I would call it also like an asymmetry in it, but I'll see if I can. Yeah. And you see, again, this is just to approach this in a simple way. You could say that our Cartesian tradition typically puts things into one of the two categories, physical or mental. Tables, chairs, rocks, and electrons are physical, while thoughts, feelings, and phenomenal properties are mental. But you see, what Bohm is suggesting that there is an ontological category that is simultaneously both, and that's information. Now, what does it mean to be simultaneously physical and mental in nature? Well, for Bohm, it means that information has these two sides, and it links these sides. And they're different from each other. Why else call them two sides, okay? Anyway, so I think this might be a good place to stop. There is maybe just a couple of final things. I want to skip that. There's a kind of a little bit of further discussion of the mind in the sense that Bohm felt that this goes back to the idea of mind as a hierarchy of levels. So we could have a given level of thought which can be surveyed from a higher level. And if you do that, then there might be a more subtle level of information which is able to organize the original set. And you see this, I think, again, this would sort of connect to Krishnamurti in the sense that, for example, if you're very confused, but you're able to perceive that in some ways, so maybe the organization could automatically happen, a kind of a coherence. And this is, again, something we could just assume that something like this this is the way the mind or intelligence works. And so let's skip this one because so you see the idea is the final point here is that if we make these meta level steps that I become aware of my thinking at some level, and then I can keep going. Bohm is claiming that this possibility of going beyond any specifiable level of subtlety is the essential feature on which the possibility of intelligence is based. And so you see, that means that at some sense, the mind is not limited. There's a kind of touch of infinity perhaps here, or at least this has to do with the human potential. And you see, one could connect this with Penrose, who says that intelligence is not algorithmic. And I think Bohm had this feeling that what intelligence is based, the possibility of intelligence based on that we can, at any given situation, we can make the higher level step. And how we do that may not be governed by an algorithm to make the necessary step. And so in that sense, I think this intelligence is implicit in this whole theory as a structure. And there again, I think this is the way, probably in the discussions with Bohm and Krishnamurti, they talked a lot about intelligence and how intelligence could operate in the mind and all the way to the brain. But I think that would be a place to stop and see where we get in the discussion. So thank you very much for your attention. Okay.
That's great, by the way.
Thanks.
When you sit down, because we're going to move
Okay.
to the panel.
Yeah.
If you can.
So maybe we can, are we there? I'm just looking at the sound person to see if we are. Yeah, they raised their fingers. Good. Maybe I would introduce first. Because Paavo we already know. He spoke just. Then there's. If you would like to say your name.
Sure. I'm Uri Maus. I'm a computational and cognitive neuroscientist from Chapman University, UCLA, and Caltech.
And that's Leah.
Hi, yes, I'm the communications director here at the KAK.
And my name is Jaap, and I think most of you know me. Would you like to start with your first question?
Well, it's I will, but it's going to be a little bit of a long question, so please bear with me.
Okay, good.
I was thinking, and I'll explain the question through what I hope will be a joke. This kind of wealthy couple have a daughter, and the daughter falls in love with this very poor but very religious guy, and the guy insists on formally asking her hand from her father. So he goes and he says, "I want to marry your daughter." And the father says, "Well, how are you going to support the family?" And the guy says, "Oh, I will pray to God, God will help me." And so, "But you have to buy a house, how are you going to do this?" "Oh, I will pray a lot, God will help me," and so on like that. So the guy leaves, the rich guy goes out to his wife and he says, "Well, I have good news and bad news. The bad news is not going to support the family, they will have no way to live. Good news is he called me God the whole time." So I'm telling you this joke because Paavo kept on using the words magic and mysterious. And in that sense, I feel like he called me a magician, because whenever it got to, and then there's some magic and then consciousness happens or something like that. So I would like to make it harder on you and say, you have to say something about that magic, otherwise what am I doing every day?
Like about how consciousness arises, or?
Yes, maybe more specifically, you asked whether consciousness is part of the causal chain that leads to action, for instance. That's more what I do, more specifically.
Right.
So how do you see that magic happening there?
Well, it's here the concept or thing that is supposed to do the work is information. And we're borrowing from David Chalmers the idea that information has these phenomenal properties. Okay, that's an assumption. Mm-hmm. Okay, and if so, then we got information in the Bohm version of the Schrödinger equation, or like in the mathematics of which Bohm felt you could extend at the high order levels of information. So if the phenomenal properties of that information do causal work, then we have a view of the mental causation. But there is an if there, which is sort of a... And now why would they be... Well, you see the thing, and that's why I showed the slide, which I actually discovered just a few weeks ago, was that the way Bohm and Hiley, they wanted to emphasize that this pilot wave is not an ordinary physical field, but they call it something subtle. Other people talk about complexity. I mean, these are, words, but the question is whether these phenomenal properties could be naturally part of this something like this pilot wave. And so in that sense, it's still something that needs to be worked out and spelled out. And I'm trying to so do it see how much we can do at the moment. But the other option is then either to have this epiphenomenalism or then deny that phenomenal properties exist, which, by the way, is today becoming fairly popular view in philosophy.
Yeah, can I?
Yeah.
Yes. I can't help thinking. So, do you, when you think about all this, do you make a difference between animal consciousness or human consciousness, or do you say there's an extra feature in human consciousness? Because what you talked about so far could be applicable to animals or even lower level creatures. It's more like how does the brain, how do you say, assemble information and then somehow acts, right? And so there's some kind of definition of consciousness which I'm, we're going around of how certain phenomena play. But so what is the consciousness that we're describing? Yeah.
Right. Well, I guess, you see, of course, in consciousness studies, people make a distinction between primary consciousness and self-consciousness, where the primary consciousness is there, can be very, a whole range of animals. Some people today discuss whether plants might be conscious, and then the panpsychist thinks that every little thing is a little bit conscious. But then self-consciousness is then thought to involve more properties, and maybe may or may not, regard language and things like that. So but it's, you can be fairly liberal with consciousness. If you think there is consciousness, more and more people are quite happy to, say that animals are conscious.
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far as plants, but as far as animals, that seems to be at least sophisticated animals or developed animals. Yeah. Okay, maybe.
I was particularly interested in the semi-significant process and meaning. So in Bohm's, when he describes that, it seems that it's not something, or it's not just something we impose onto matter, it's inherently bound up with it. That seems to resonate with some of Kay's ideas and teachings that perception isn't separate from what we're perceiving, like the observer is the observed. Would you say that this suggests consciousness isn't just in the brain and that it's in the movement of meaning itself?
Well, that's again, that's an interesting question. I mean, of course, that could even take us to discuss artificial intelligence, whether, suppose somebody could set up these information structures in our artificial system. This is actually a lot of people discuss this now with the large language models, I think this question of perception is interesting. Like Krishnamurti was interested in the notion of the observer and the observed, which we usually take to be separate in the mental domain, but maybe actually they are not, and that would be, but that would maybe be a slightly different from this question of soma significance. I can't immediately see how they would be related, but there's probably is one, but I just can't see it now.
So, you talk a lot about how quantum mechanics might explain consciousness. You also mentioned at some point the quantum bug. And when people talk about how quantum mechanics could explain consciousness, I'm always worried that they're using what sometimes people call the minimization of mysteries in the universe, in the sense that, quantum mechanics is very mysterious, and there are all these jokes, right, about do 5 people understand it? Trying to even think who are these people who can really understand it? Okay, so quantum mechanics is mysterious. Consciousness is mysterious, so then they somehow must be related, because we need to minimize the number of mysteries in the universe, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm always worried whether there is really, really more to that than just this minimization, because if something is mysterious, we don't completely understand, and we can, kind of wave our hands. It's hard with a microphone, but wave our hands a bit here, and there's a pilot wave, and there's a Schrödinger equation, and do you really think that there is a deep connection there, or is that connection kind of, there might be, I don't know, depending if a lot of these assumptions are met, maybe. Does the question make sense?
Yeah. No, that is of course quite a common objection. But I guess I have never felt that so strongly, because in a way, like what Bohm was trying to do throughout his whole life was actually to understand quantum mechanics without actually bringing consciousness in the first place. So in a way, he was trying to just minimize one mystery for a long time at least. And you see, so I think the argument should more go that consciousness has certain features that are very difficult to explain in mechanistic terms. And mechanistic terms is the way we think that there's a system where you have parts which interact in more or less mechanical fashion. And so that consciousness would have this, for example, very holistic properties. They talk about the unity of consciousness and so. And you see, then people say if you compare classical physics and quantum physics, people like Niels Bohr, but also David Bohm, they would say that the key new feature of quantum mechanics is a certain kind of undivided wholeness. So it's not a mystery. It's actually something that you do these experiments of non-locality, which suggests that there is a new kind of wholeness. And with all these things, there's a lot of debate. There are different views. So it's not as if everybody agrees that there is non-locality, but a lot of people do. And so they feel that if you're bitten by the quantum bug, you're trying to explain consciousness, and if your general framework is either a classical physics mechanistic framework or quantum mechanical, more holistic framework, I think if you're bitten by the quantum bug, you say, why not use both? Because you could say obviously a lot of neural processes, you don't need quantum mechanics. At the level we're studying them and describing them. But you see, then it could be that for the more holistic aspects of consciousness, if you want to explain them, not to, if you like, get rid of the mystery, you might then, people are trying to use then things from the quantum toolbox in various ways, and of course, there's still there's a lot of, I know this always, like I had this course on consciousness right before coming here, and we had student presentations. So somebody did talk about the Penrose hammer of them. By far the longest conversation, because there's so many open questions, so many assumptions, we could go through. But my sense is that there something could emerge from there, and it's going to need time, and especially we need to get clearer on quantum physics itself. I remember once Basil Hiley told me that he asked John Searle that, why don't you philosophers of mind, when you talk about matter, why don't you talk about quantum mechanics? Why are you doing classical physics? Come on, it's 100 years old. We got 100 years of quantum mechanics. Searle said, you guys get your act together, because you see, the trouble with quantum mechanics is there's a different interpretations. You go and talk to physicist A, they will say one thing, the next one will say this. And of course, then I will say, well, look at the Bohm theory, and that's the way to go.
May I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
Okay. So if I go outside now and my car is no longer in the parking lot, I will not assume that it's because of quantum tunneling, right? I would assume that one of you brave people decided to take it for a ride. In the same way, that's of course the big question. And how do you connect something that happens at such many orders of magnitude below neurons to something that would affect? And I mean, yes, you've got Penrose and Stuart Hameroff and so on saying, well, it's the microtubules, but that's really where you're stuck, in my opinion. Maybe you have a different opinion. Like, how do these very, very small things that should average out many orders of magnitude above them, how do they end up affecting our brain or anything to really have an effect that doesn't just cancel out?
Yeah. Well, fair enough. I mean, of course, in what I was, in the talk that I was giving, I wasn't giving too much importance in the quantum level, in the sense that we reduce consciousness to quantum level. The Bohm idea is more that this pilot wave plays a role in this two-way traffic. but you say, well, how could it play the role? Well, I guess that's the idea is that it's this idea of amplification, because even in physics, when you do experiments with the electrons, the electron is a quantum object. Then you have this measuring apparatus, which is big like your car, right? And then the measuring, what makes it into a measuring apparatus, that it can talk to the quantum object. There has to be some sort of interaction. But also, what really makes it into a measuring apparatus is that it can actually amplify the effect to the macro level, so that the needle, the macroscopic needle, the pointer will point to a value, and that's your result. Okay. And you see now something like that actually happens in our retina, because our retina is sensitive to just a few quanta or quantum objects. So I guess the idea there is that if this pilot wave would play a role in this two-way traffic between mental and physical, then there has to be this kind of amplification process somewhere. And Bohm would say, well, it can happen in the retina, which is 37 Celsius. Retina being, you might say it's a part of the brain. It could happen elsewhere, where need be.
So yeah, I have. I'm going to fold two questions in one, if you're okay with that. Yeah. So first, you already clarified that the distinction between self-consciousness and consciousness, right? So, and I think in Krishnamurti's work, it's probably mostly about self-consciousness, and in various places, Krishnamurti would talk about consciousness is its content, right? Thought produced, however neural processes are happening, whichever part of the brain are responsible for it, somehow create responses, thoughts, and that content, which is maybe dependent on the past, only on the past, and creates the sense of self. Now, but then somewhere in that work with Bohm, where you see them discussing, they somehow separate out brain and mind. And because you were part of some of those discussions, I would just wonder what your take is on that, because that's a really fascinating aspect to me.
Well, yeah, it's true. That there is this sort of course, that it's a bit like dualism. If you separate them,
yeah.
In the sense, then the next question is: are they absolutely separate, or do they have something in common? And if they have nothing in common, then how do they interact? And we get into that. But I do recall sometimes that this was actually like a telephone call with Bohm in late 80s. I remember the room where of course it's just memory. I could say it might come up for me. Anyway, and he was describing, and he was actually describing this kind of dualist view that somehow feeling that there's the brain, which maybe has a mechanical operation, and then there is this intelligence that maybe somehow the brain can respond to it somehow. And that struck to me as being too dualistic, and I said that to him, and I think he has said that he feels it's consistent. So at times, at least, he had this more of this sense that there is an intelligence that is not in the brain, and that, of course, then you easily feel. So, are we now in some religious domain already, or what's this? But maybe in Bohm's case, it could be that he thought that the intelligence could be. For him, it was not a personal God. That's something he made quite clear, that it's not, for him, there should be other kinds. I think Bohm was troubled, but whenever religion is mentioned, then people think there's got to be a personal God or something like that. For him, it was something different. I think maybe he felt that it's something that operates in nature, maybe even in biology, again, dangerously close to something like creationism. But I think he had this notion of generative order, as a way of generating new structures, and I think he felt that even in biology that this generative order makes kind of proposals, and then Darwin takes it over from there. So there's survival of the fittest, if you like. But so I think he liked to make those kinds of distinctions, and those would fit very well with what the discussions he was having with Krishnamurti. But somehow I always felt a little bit uneasy about that because, well, first of all, difficult to sell in the philosophy department. but even otherwise, just somehow that I sort of I don't know. Yeah.
But there must be a way of formulating that without introducing a personalized God or something like that, right? I mean, that's one pathway of multitude of possibilities.
Yeah.
I just wanted to give the in-person audience a chance to ask some questions. There's a microphone right there. So if you wanted to line up right there, if you have any questions, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ranjit. So when you talk about the quantum mind, to me, I associate that with a quantum brain and the physics that drives physiology, which is a memory bank. So when I'm in Russia, they were working with what we call brainwashing using a computer to feed in and isolate this. Today we are looking at stuff with the deep mind that operates at 1 billion times the speed of an existing computer in this country, in Cambridge. There's also laboratories that are isolating the physiology through frequency to influence this. So I'm concerned about how this is going. But one other thing I'd like to express, my time in Russia, my R&R escape to Scandinavia, and I have very fond memories of sailing in, and the Finnish fishermen greeting us with terve terve mitä kuuluu.
Mitä kuuluu? Oikein hyvä. That was in Finnish. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay, but that was more like a comment, right? So I thank you for that.
Hi. Just a question of how I see Krishnamurti's teachings as pointing to suffering and conflict as being the issue at hand with human beings. And my question was, how does the science in any way relate to suffering, the causes that, of conflict that we might be enacting on ourselves or one another, and does it offer anything clarifying about potentially an end to that type of psychological suffering? So that fragmentation element, how does the science align with that or differ?
Yeah, thanks. That's important question. Actually, I've written one article about psychopathology in relation to this theory. That's you can find it on my homepage. But I think what is there thinking. Remember, there's this thing about meaning. Meaning is being, or that our physiological state is profoundly affected what things mean to us. And this is, of course, pretty much coherent with what Krishnamurti and Bohm were discussing, and so it's more like trying to understand the meaning in our lives, and of course their thought is the main carrier of meaning for us, the way that we're trying to sort things out. And of course, I mean, this theme that Bohm got from Krishnamurti was that thought, which is our highest achievement in many ways, is also pretty much the source of all our problems. And then when we try to solve our problems with the way we think today, we're actually using the problem to solve the problem, in the sense that we're just, in that sense, making it worse. And then the question was whether there could be this intelligence come into play. this might, I said just a little bit about that in this hierarchy of levels, that is some kind of perception. But you see, I was reading David Moody's book. It's Uncommon Collaboration. It was about Bohm and Krishnamurti on the plane, just where he describes very well those discussions, and I highly recommend the book if somebody hasn't read it. I think my sense there was that with Krishnamurti, he wasn't so much trying to do elaborate theories, but he was using words that would make you perceive something. What? Well, yourself, the fact of your thinking, and maybe especially that your thinking is a main source of your problems, and of course then not only yours but the whole, because you know the slogan, "You are the world," from Krishna. That was one of the things that struck me. You are the world, in the sense that you are the world and the world is you. So as in my late 90s, I was probably just thinking about my own problems anyway, hoping that maybe something would help there, and then you get the perception that actually there's a sense in which your problems are the problems of the world. These two are not separate. And I understand that actually when with Live Aid, when they were planning the song, somebody, I don't know if it was Michael Roach, I forget who it was, but they suggested "You Are the World." Let's take it from Krishnamurti, the name of the song. And then somebody, maybe Quincy Jones, so no, that's too, let's say, "We Are the World." But as far as I know, that came from Kay, and so kind of indirectly and transformed, and so you see. So what I'm saying there is that in the Krishnamurti approach, the solution was not only to try to make a theory of mind and then go and apply it and save the world through that. It was more that somehow each and everybody has to actually perceive their own situation, and from this inner perspective. And you see, then of course the question is whether there is some sort of operation of whether that perception goes with some intelligence, whether there is some order or harmony or coherence that would come out of it. But it's not easy. It's been very interesting even in this visit to talk with various people. When did you become interested in Krishnamurti? How did it? And so for somebody standing in a bookshop, I know a couple of people who including Bohm. He was in the library reading. Mrs. Bohm brought him the book First and Last Freedom because there was something about the observant observed. Apparently Bohm read it just by standing, and then he think, "Oh yeah, I'm interested in this." And so in a sense it can be a very quick process. But of course then it does need a lot of work and to make those connections. So I don't know if I answered the question, but
May I offer a quick thing?
Yeah.
So you mentioned, or there was mentioned also AI, and in that respect, there is some discussion about AI and consciousness, and I think some of that is misguided. Let's assume that every time we upload a picture of a bottle into ChatGPT, let's say that ChatGPT, I don't think so, but let's say that ChatGPT has an experience of some sort when it's looking at the image. To some extent, well, that's really not the problem. I think actually the problem has to do more with what are the intentions of these things. But if you think about suffering, that's where it becomes, I think, interesting. Because if you can assume that these things at some point can suffer, then, right, are we introducing more suffering into the world? Not only are we draining the lakes to cool down the CPU farms to get these things, but we're also introducing more. I think that's, so just, it's not an answer to your question, but it's just saying that in this brave new world now, we might be getting into an area where it's going to be even more important to ask these kinds of questions.
We've got time for one more.
I've been interested in Krishnamurti for years, and another thing that I have done is participated in something called sensory awareness. And it's a process of kind of stepping outside of your normal routine, and you're guided to pay attention to your physical, it looks like it's your physical experience. So they might just have you like put your hand on the back of your neck and get in touch with your sensation and the feeling in your neck, and it can affect the alignment of your neck. And they take you through a number of steps in this process. And what I find is that I guess if I'm going to make the terminology isn't exactly the same, but I find that some of the tensions and the emotional charges and the kind of conditioned mind, to use Krishnamurti language, kind of drops away, kind of the matrix that we carry through us in our lives. And in the process of doing that, now I can't say this would be for everybody, but that there's an awareness and a kind of like you're going through life and you have this dusty windshield and it's wiped clean and you're able to perceive your immediate experience more clearly without encumbrance. And in that process, when I was in college and I did some of this work, I'd go back to school and like my level of my writing jumped a level. Like instead of a B+, it was like an A. You know, the ability to articulate was another level. And so it appears to be a somatic experience. It's apparently looking at your own sensory experience, but I find that it affected my ability to write, my ability to communicate, and actually my ability to authentically relate with other people. I'm not saying it lasts forever, because we are in a culture that tends to erode that. But I just find it that in a way, it's going to the same place that I think Krishnamurti is pointing to. So,
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good, that's it. We're having lunch. It's served in the main room. Thank you. See you this afternoon.
Thank you.